Hi, I just wanted to touch base about some of the chapters that have no biblical readings in it that I would be going over, but I wanted to make sure that you are actually taking a look at them. So, if you look at the modules, I've been kind of skimming through the chapter PowerPoints in the video, in the professor videos. And so far I kind of touched base and said, hey, maybe you should pay attention to this or that. But starting with chapter 9, I'm kind of assuming that you're reading the chapters and that you're taking a look at these PowerPoints that accompany each chapter, but there really isn't any biblical material assigned to each of these, but they're important because you should know the context or the content of these chapters without actually looking at the primary texts. So, for example, chapter 9 talks about the rest of those writings, the ones that we actually, are not going to cover, which includes apocalyptic literature. And the thing that's actually kind of key is you should know this background that the chapter covers, like what happened after the Babylonians took over the southern kingdom of Judah. Cyrus of the Persians actually brought them back and allowed them back into Judea. Now, if as I'm saying these things, you're saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. Who are the Assyrians? Who are the Babylonians? What are these dates that you're throwing around? Then you better go back and look at those chapters, the ones that outline the history of Israel, because you really do need to know the historical context of all of these books in order to understand why they're even in the Bible. So, in here, um, after the leaders of Judah are taken to Babylon, leaving destroyed Jerusalem behind, in 535, under the Persian Empire, which takes over the Babylonians, Cyrus calls the Messiah of the Lord in 2nd Isaiah and allows the Judeans to bring them back into Judea. So these types of information, that's contained in here is really important, even if you don't have to read the books that are ascribed to that time period. So, after they come back, they rebuild the second temple. The first temple was built by Solomon but destroyed during the exile. And then Nehemiah was one of the governors that was sent to help it. So basically giving you an overview of what happened after they came back to Judea, built the second temple, who was involved, what's the dating between Nehemiah and Ezra, who came first, what was the Hellenistic Age then? Because the Greeks in 323 or 333 basically take over the Persian Empire, and in so doing take over that province of Judea. So what happens in the Greek time period? So if you think about the sequence of events, the Babylonians take over the southern kingdom of Judah in 587. Judah remains in exile in Babylon, from 587 to about 539, 535, at which point the Persians take over the Babylonians and allow the Jews to come back. This is all about the Ezra and Nehemiah in the previous slides and in chapter 9. Then the Persians are taken over by the Greeks in 333 BCE. By Alexander the Great, thereby introducing a whole new slew of new cultural ideas and new and different ways of pottery and coinage and all sorts of things, and a polytheistic religion too. So the Greeks take over Judea. After Alexander dies in 323, the kingdom is divided amongst basically three: the Seleucids, the Ptolemaic, and what was the third one? Anyway, initially, at least in this region of the world, it's split between the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic. Then, they go over two short stories of Ruth and Esther, and then later on in the Greek time period, because the situation for Jews at that point was so tenuous and so last minute and so kind of like a borderline, are we going to, last? it ends up that a lot more apocalyptic writing. This is when wisdom literature also comes in. A lot more apocalyptic writing comes out, which is, end of times, something's going to happen, something cataclysmic, right? And that's where the book of Daniel comes in, which you will also not read. So just make sure that, you take a look at chapter 9 in terms of the historical context of the time period after the exile, okay? Then you should also look at chapter 10, which describes Jewish life in the Roman period. The Roman takes over the Greek time period, and the context of the Roman time period or Judaism of that time period is important because it's the context out of which Jesus arises. So if you want to know what the historical setting for the time of Jesus is, you kind of have to know about this historical world as well. So between 200 BCE and 100 CE is one of the most vital and creative in the history of Judaism. So lots of stuff happened in the Roman period with the Jews, primarily all the different kinds of Jewish groups that come out during the Roman period in the Roman Empire, but specifically within Judea itself, right? Because as Jesus comes on the scene and he has a lot of arguments with all these different types of people, you have to understand who those different types of people are. So you should understand the historical context. So they talk about the Maccabean period, which is the period shortly before the Roman time period, and the context of the rulers, like Herod was ruler from 40 to 4 BCE. He was the one who was in charge when Jesus was around. Different kinds of editing in terms of the canon, in terms of the Tanakh, the different groups within Judaism, like the Pharisees. Here's more stuff about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Covenanters, and the Zealots and the Samaritans. So make sure that you also read chapter 10 and understand who all these different groups are. The two groups that Jesus will primarily be kind of discussing with are, and in the Bible, they are called the teachers of the texts or the rabbis. Those would be the Pharisees. So you should be familiar with who the Pharisees are from chapter 10 and its background. He also argues a lot with priests. Those would be the Sadducees, who are the head of the temple. They're kind of like the cultural elite, and the religious elite. And they are also head of the Sanhedrin Council, which is the Jewish high council that actually brings Jesus up on trial. So you should definitely know who the Sadducees are. You should know the Zealots because the Romans believed Jesus to be a zealot. Zealots were people who fought against Roman rule and fought against Greek rule. So they were the ones that took up arms for it. And the language that Jesus and his followers were saying about the kingdom of God and the social order will be uprooted and uplifted sounded zealot-like to the Roman authorities. So that's probably why they had him arrested, was because he sounded like a zealot. So you should be familiar with who they are. And some of the other groups too. So make sure that you read chapter 10. Make sure you read the PowerPoint that goes with it, which kind of functions as an outline, and then understand that context before you start the New Testament material. I know it's a lot of reading, but always remember this is a 5-week class. That's very fast. Normally classes are 14 weeks, so you're basically getting 2.5 weeks worth of work in every week. So it's a lot, but just try to keep up. Okay? All right. So as you start going into kind of the New Testamental period, there's going to be a lot of background reading, like I said, in the Hauer textbook. The one that really kind of introduces you to the biblical material is chapter 11, or the chapter that basically describes who Jesus is. Okay, so before you start tackling the birth narratives or the Gospel of Mark that actually goes over the life of Jesus, make sure you read chapter 11 so you understand who he is, what he did, where does he come from. What is the context of his life? Who does he talk to? What kind of things does he say? Those types of things you should probably understand before you actually tackle reading the Bible or reading the Gospels about it. Okay? So let's go over a little bit of that. Remember, cannot be understood unless viewed through the lens of first century Judaism, which is why chapter 10 is so important. Okay? There's a few extra canonical meaning outside of the Bible references to Jesus. They call him Joshua, so it could have been like anyone named Joshua. But Josephus seems to talk about a figure named Joshua or Jesus, and specifically James, Jesus' brother, as being the head of the church. So James is mentioned, John the Baptist is mentioned, and then tangentially, Jesus is mentioned as well. There is a couple of other citations that they describe, most of them several hundred years after Jesus, so that's kind of a problem. So you can take a look at that. In terms of the Gospels, as in, who was Jesus, right? Overall, people tend to agree that Jesus was a Jew from Galilee. Galilee is the northern section of this region. There were different governors for the different regions. So Judea was one region, Galilee was another, and they would have separate governors. So he was a Galilean Jew, a northern Jew for the first century that kind of traveled around, kind of, like the state of Rhode Island-ish, that type of area. He was a teacher, a wonder worker. He did miracles. His basic message was love thy neighbor, or a love doctrine. People around him claimed that he was the Messiah, because in Judaism, they are waiting for a Messiah. They just don't believe that Jesus is him. And so that idea that there is someone coming, kind of like Elijah or Moses or some type of figure that's coming, is actually in Judaism. And so these early Christians were Jews that believed that their Messiah had come. It ended up, because he had issues with both the Jewish high authorities and the Roman authorities, who thought he was a zealot, that he was eventually executed by the Romans, by Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius. So all of that is actually mentioned in the Gospel, so it's really great when we can pinpoint the dating of the life of Jesus by the people that actually existed. But they basically have it right, in terms of timing. Yeah, Pontius Pilate was then, so Quirinius was governor of Syria at that point, and those are cited in the Gospels, so it's kind of handy that it fits in time-wise. In general, Jesus seemed to be very aware that he was Jewish, that he was familiar with the Hebrew Bible. He understood the tenets, the theology, the teachings, etc. And really, almost everything in his teachings are mirrored in the Old Testament. Like, he basically knew his own tradition, okay? And even said the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible, is irrevocable, meaning don't challenge it. It's absolutely right. It's a newer and different way of looking at what is right. So that's what he was like. He was saying everything that is old is new. Like, I've got a new set of eyes at looking at this most absolutely, important theology that we have in the Torah. He seems comfortable in terms of all of the Jewish traditions and things like that. And I think considered himself a Jew amongst his Jewish disciples. It's just that the Jews who confronted him didn't consider him a Jew, because of the whole Messiah thing. So, and they didn't want God punishing them or anything, and this guy seemed like a troublemaker. So even though he thought of himself as a Jew, other Jews didn't really consider him a real Jew. Okay? So I will stop here so that we can finish up the rest of like who Jesus is, and then we'll go over his life, and then we will go, take a handle or a grasp of the biblical passages, specifically using the birth narratives first, or the first couple of chapters of each of the Gospels. All right, so I will finish this up, kind of go over the general biography of Jesus, and then we'll tackle the birth narratives. All right? Okay.